This is the Bible Book Club. I'm Heather.
And I'm Susan.
And we're in the book of 1 Kings. Welcome to the club. In chapters 5 and 6 of 1 Kings, Solomon began his building plan for the temple. He contracted with Hiram, king of Tyre, for all the building supplies. Then he organized over 187,000 laborers. In the 480th year after the Israelites released from Egypt, they began building, and it took 7.5 years to complete the temple. It was twice the size of the Tabernacle, 30 feet wide and 90 feet long, but the scale was the same. The holy place was twice the size of the most holy place. The interior was covered in gold.
All right, here's our setup. The temple's up, and the author moves on in scene 1 of chapter 7 to Solomon builds his palace complex.
It took Solomon 13 years, however, to complete the construction of his palace. He built the palace of the forest of Lebanon, 100 cubits long, 50 wide, and 30 high, with 4 rows of cedar columns supporting trimmed cedar beams. It was roofed with cedar above the beams that rested on the columns, 45 beams, 15 to a row. Its windows were placed high in sets of 3, facing each other. All the doorways had rectangular frames. They were in the front part in sets of 3, facing each other. He made a colonnade, 50 cubits long and 30 wide. In front of it was a portico, and in front of that were pillars and an overhang roof. He built the throne hall, the hall of justice, where he was to judge, and he covered it with cedar from floor to ceiling. And the palace in which he was to live, set further back, was similar in design. Solomon also made a palace like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had married. All these structures, from the outside to the great courtyard and from the foundation to eaves, were made of blocks of high-grade stone cut to size and smoothed on their inner and outer faces. The foundations were laid with large stones of good quality, some measuring 10 cubits and some 8. Above were high-grade stones cut to size and cedar beams. The great courtyard was surrounded by a wall of 3 courses of dressed stone and 1 course of trimmed cedar beams, as was the inner courtyard of the temple of the Lord with its portico.
It took 13 years to build the palace, almost twice as long as the temple, for good reason. It was much larger, and it was much more than a palace. The palace served as both a residence for the king and government administration. It was a compound of buildings, not just a beautiful house. Unfortunately, nothing is left of the palace, but this description alone gives us an idea of what it may have looked like. So the first building described was the Great Assembly Hall, or Palace of the Forest of Lebanon. It measured about 146 feet long and 73 feet wide. The roof was supported by 45 pillars, giving it the appearance of an indoor forest, hence its name, the Palace of the Forest of Lebanon. Now, the Hall of Pillars is the room described next. This most likely was not a separate building, but a room or colonnade that served as an entrance to the Great Assembly Hall, also called the Forest. The Hall of Pillars was as long as the Great Assembly Hall was wide. It probably was something like the foyer of a large ballroom today. The throne hall, or hall of justice, is the third room or building described. This would be where Solomon sits when he is in court as judge. Now, the palace of Solomon, where he and his servants lived, was a separate building in another courtyard set back from the administrative buildings. And then lastly, Pharaoh's daughter had her own palace, probably adjacent to Solomon's. Now, the author gives the stone in these buildings a lot of attention, as he did in the building of the temple. And for good reason. Just the sight of those stones rolling down the streets of Israel would have created a stir. Each stone in the foundation was about 11 to 15 feet. They were huge, like the size of a small bedroom. And there were so many of them. Stone was used not only in the foundation of this entire compound, the temple, the palace, the administrative buildings, but also in the framework too. Each stone was hewn to measure at the quarry and then transported to Jerusalem. How they moved that much stone at that size is a mystery to me, but I guess it took about 187,000 men, so no surprise there. It took a lot of careful planning, measuring, transporting, and building. Scene 2, Solomon furnishes the temple, just like Moses furnished the tabernacle. Both the tabernacle and the temple contained the altar of burnt offerings and altar of incense. Both have a laver or basin for washing, table of showbread, and menorah. And both had bronze artifacts in the courtyard and gold artifacts in the temple. And both were decorated with a Garden of Eden motif of flowers, fruits, and trees. The difference between the tabernacle and the temple was the size, the materials used, and the quantity. Solomon kept the scale the same, but everything in the temple was bigger and more expensive. And that is why the author of 1 Kings is so enamored of the details. The building of the temple was a long-awaited dream come true. The temple and the palace were a sign to the world. Every other surrounding nation had glorious buildings and tribute temples to their gods, never Israel. Yet they loved their God and knew him to be the one true God, and they wanted the world to know him. The temple represented credibility, stability, and most of all, the presence of God among them. And the author of 1 Kings is prodigiously proud of every quarried stone and every golden candlestick that went into Israel's precious temple. Chapter 7 continued.
In verse 13, King Solomon sent to Tyre and brought Huram, whose mother was a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and whose father was from Tyre, and a skilled craftsman in bronze. Huram was filled with wisdom, with understanding, and with knowledge to do all kinds of bronze work. He came to King Solomon and did all the work assigned to him.
So during the time of the book of Judges, the tribe of Asher failed to drive out the inhabitants of the cities of the Phoenician coast. The tribe of Naphtali lived right next door to the tribe of Asher. So the result was intermarriage with the Phoenicians for both tribes. This gifted bronze craftsman, Huram, has a Phoenician father and an Israelite mother from the tribe of Naphtali. His time and talent must have been for such a time as this, because he's going to oversee a lot of work in the temple. Next, our author is going to describe the bronze artifacts. Now, all the items to be used in the temple courtyard by the priests were bronze. So the first bronze items that they describe are the pillars of Jachin and Boaz.
Verse 15, he cast 2 bronze pillars, each 18 cubits high and 12 cubits in circumference. He also made 2 capitals of cast bronze to set on the tops of the pillars. Each capital was 5 cubits high. A network of interwoven chains adorned the capitals on top of the pillars, 7 for each capital. He made pomegranates in 2 rows, encircling each network to decorate the capitals on top of the pillars. He did the same for each capital. The capitals on top of the pillars in the portico were in the shape of lilies, 4 cubits high. On the capitals of both pillars, above the bowl-shaped part next to the network, were the 200 pomegranates in rows all around. He erected the pillars at the portico of the temple. The pillar to the south he named Jachin, and the one to the north, Boaz. The capitals on top were in the shape of lilies, and so the work on the pillars was completed.
The pillars of Jachin and Boaz are massive. Each pillar is about 6 feet wide and had a capital on top that made the entire pillar 34 feet tall. The capitals were in the shape of lilies decorated with tightly woven chainwork in a net pattern and lots of pomegranates. Now the pillar names have meaning. Jachin means he will establish. Boaz means in him is strength. When combined, they send a message or a prayer that God will establish his people or the line of David, and he is the strength of the nation and its king. Next, Huram built the bronze sea.
Verse 23, he made the sea of cast metal, circular in shape, measuring 10 cubits from rim to rim and 5 cubits high. It took a line of 30 cubits to measure around it. Below the rim, gourds encircled it, 10 to a cubit. The gourds were cast in 2 rows in one piece with the sea. The sea stood on 12 bowls, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south and 3 facing east. The sea rested on top of them, and their hindquarters were toward the center. It was a handbreadth in thickness, and its rim was like the rim of a cup, like a lily blossom. It held 2,000 baths.
Okay, you got to Google pictures of this. That's all I can say, because it's hard to kind of imagine. So the Bronze Sea was an enormous elevated water basin, or laver. It's considered, this laver, this giant one, was considered a great feat of ancient metalwork because of its size. The basin was 15 feet in diameter and 7.5 feet high. It was supported by these 12 bronze bulls, like carrying it on their back and their heads facing out, 3 on each side. And it held 11,000 to 17,000 gallons of water. That's what they estimate.
What was it for? Just for appearances?
Okay. It was a supersized version of the water basin that they used in the tabernacle to cleanse themselves, the priests, before they went into the temple. So the Bronze Sea was much larger counterpart to the bronze basin in the tabernacle described in Exodus 30:17. So listen for what it was used for.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Make a bronze basin with its bronze stand for washing. Place it between the tent of meeting and the altar and put water in it. Aaron and his sons are to wash their hands and feet with water from it. Whenever they enter the tent of meeting, they shall wash with water so that they will not die. Also, when they approach the altar to minister by presenting a food offering to the Lord, they shall wash their hands and feet so that they will not die. This is to be a lasting ordinance for Aaron and his descendants for the generations to come."
So remember, when we went through Leviticus, there's this purity thing. Actually, I think it was Numbers about, they had to be really clean and pure and cleansing, all these cleansing rituals. So the water was used for the priests to wash and purify before entering the temple. And there were many priests and many daily ritual tasks that took place at the temple. So there is much speculation about how they filled the basin, because when you think of how big this is, where did the water come from? Well, remember, it's thought that the Gibeonites originally supplied the water, because recall in season 6 in the book of Joshua, chapter 6, the Gibeonites tricked Joshua into a treaty. And because of the treaty, Joshua could not kill them. And in verse 27 of that chapter 6 of Joshua, it says this:
"That day, Joshua made the Gibeonites woodcutters and water carriers for the assembly to provide for the needs of the altar of the Lord at the place the Lord would choose. And that is what they are to this day."
So my thought is Solomon knew he had this free labor because the Gibeonites had to provide the water. And so he really supersized that Bronze Sea. It's thought that later on, a conduit connected this huge Bronze Sea, the basin, to Solomon's pools or to one of the reservoirs that have been discovered underneath all that stone. So they were ingenious back then, because there are some architects, you can go Google this too, who amidst all that stone, because remember this foundation was layers of stone, they have found these huge reservoirs that have been plastered over to hold water in them for all this washing.
So it was like underground water holding?
Yeah, they plastered the stone.
How did they get it out?
I don't know. I wish they did. And there's also
have to pump it out.
Yeah. Well, and there's tunnels under there, and there's all kinds of stuff they've discovered. Nothing recently, unfortunately, because they can't get to it. Okay. So then next, Huram built 10 smaller basins to assist in the washing, because guess what? This is me talking now. I don't know this, but when you look at the pictures of this big basin, the Bronze Sea, they call it, it was so big. I don't know how they got up to it. They thought maybe it overflowed into like a lower pool that they could wash around. They don't know. So then they've got these 10 smaller basins.
Verse 27, "He also made 10 movable stands of bronze. Each was 4 cubits long, 4 wide, and 3 high. This is how the stands were made. They had side panels attached to uprights. On the panels between the uprights were lions, bulls, and cherubim, and on the uprights as well. Above and below the lions and bulls were wreaths of hammered work. Each stand had 4 bronze wheels with bronze axles, and each had a basin resting on 4 supports, cast with wreaths on each side. On the inside of the stand, there was an opening that had a circular frame 1 cubit deep. This opening was round, and with its basework, it measured 1.5 cubits. Around its opening, there was engraving. The panels of the stands were square, not round. The 4 wheels were under the panels, and the axles of the wheels were attached to the stand. The diameter of each wheel was 1.5 cubits. The wheels were made like chariot wheels. The axles, rims, spokes, and hubs were all cast of metal. Each stand had 4 handles, one on each corner, projecting from the stand. At the top of the stand, there was a circular band 0.5 cubit deep. The supports and panels were attached to the top of the stand. He engraved cherubim, lions, and palm trees on the surfaces of the supports and on the panels in every available space with wreaths all around. This is the way he made the 10 stands. They were all cast in the same molds and were identical in size and shape. He then made 10 bronze basins, each holding 40 baths and measuring 4 cubits across, 1 basin to go on each of the 10 stands. He placed 5 of the stands on the south side of the temple and 5 on the north. He placed the sea on the south side, at the southeast corner of the temple. He also made the pots and shovels and sprinkling bowls.
So the 10 watering basins on carts were unique to the temple. The tabernacle did not have such heavy equipment because they were a mobile community when the tabernacle was in use and they couldn't drag it all over the wilderness. Each of these 10 basins was 6 feet wide and held 220 gallons. The stands or carts that held the water basins were elaborately decorated and had big wheels. Although I imagine they weren't easy to move with all that water. 5 of the basins and carts were placed on the south side and 5 on the north, and all would have been used for ritual cleansing. And because they were probably, sacrificing so many animals, they probably did a lot of washing. I mean, it would smell if they didn't. Just think of that blood everywhere. Yuck.
And it was also kind of like hygiene he was teaching them, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. Continuing in verse 40. So Hiram finished all the work he had undertaken for King Solomon in the temple of the Lord. The 2 pillars, the 2 bowl-shaped capitals on top of the pillars, the 2 sets of network decorating the 2 bowl-shaped capitals on top of the pillars, the 400 pomegranates for the 2 sets of network, 2 rows of pomegranates for each network decorating the bowl, shaped capitals on top of the pillars, the 10 stands with their 10 basins, the sea, and the 12 bowls under it, the pots, shovels, and sprinkling bowls. All these objects that Hiram made for King Solomon for the temple of the Lord were burnished bronze. The king had them cast in clay molds in the plain of the Jordan between Succoth and Zethrian. Solomon left all these things unweighted because there were so many. The weight of the bronze was not determined.
So it cracks me up that the author was so proud of these bronze items that he makes another inventory of them. But he left one thing out. He did not mention the altar of burnt offering, which we know was made because the author of 2 Chronicles 4 did record that. Listen.
He made a bronze altar 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 10 cubits high.
So the interesting thing about this is the altar that is actually in the courtyard outside the temple, and it's where they sacrificed all the animals. So this altar was 35 feet by 35 feet and placed 17 feet high on a platform with stairs up to it. It's huge. It's almost like everybody, I guess, watched when their animal was sacrificed because, they each brought animals to atone for their sin. So the tabernacle version of the altar of burnt offerings is in Exodus 27, and it was like 1/5 this size, about 7 feet square and 4.5 feet high. But the purpose of the altar was the same for the tabernacle and for the temple. It was used for burnt offerings for sin atonement. And if you were with us, and actually there was another feast it was used for. Oh, I can't remember. The Feast of Burnt Offerings. If you were with us in season 3 of the book of Leviticus, you will recall that there was a lot of daily animal sacrifice on that altar. So based on the way Solomon has enlarged the water basins and the altar of burnt offerings, it appears that he is planning to greatly expand the kingdom.
And that he has intentions of doing good for the Lord because they're planning a whole bunch of sacrificing.
Yes, he is ready. All right, that's all the bronze stuff. Here are the gold artifacts. Gold is only used inside the temple. just as bronze was only used in the courtyard. Gold was more precious and therefore set the temple apart as more sacred.
Verse 48, Solomon also made all the furnishings that were in the Lord's temple, the golden altar.
The author does not give us any details about the size of this. However, we know from Exodus 30 that the gold altar was the altar of incense. It was smaller and more beautiful than the altar of burnt offerings in the courtyard. This altar was to be placed in the holy place or main room of the temple in front of the curtain that leads to the most holy place. Its purpose was to burn incense, which symbolized the prayers of God's people.
The golden table on which was placed the bread of the presence.
Again, the author gives no detail. He probably assumes we are good Hebrews and we have read Exodus and Leviticus and know all about this table. This table will be put in the holy place, not the most holy place, as will the lampstand and the incense altar we already mentioned. This table is for the purpose of holding the bread of the presence. These were 12 loaves of bread that were placed every Sabbath, representing the 12 tribes who were under the constant provision and care of God.
Verse 49, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the right and 5 on the left, in front of the inner sanctuary, the gold floral work and lamps and tongs.
The lampstands, like the basin, get a large upgrade in the temple. The tabernacle had just one lampstand. The temple gets 10, which makes sense. The temple is so much larger. So the purpose of the lampstand was to light the main area or holy place. The lampstand looks like a candelabra, but candles were not used at this time. It was actually oil with a wick.
Verse 50, the pure gold basins, wick trimmers, sprinkling bowls, dishes, and censers, and the gold sockets for the doors of the innermost room, the most holy place, and also for the doors of the main hall of the temple. When all the work King Solomon had done for the temple of the Lord was finished, he brought in the things his father David had dedicated, the silver and gold and the furnishings, and he placed them in the treasuries of the Lord's temple.
Every single aspect of the temple was carefully and elaborately created. The only furnishing Solomon did not have to make was the only original piece of furniture created under Moses' instruction over 400 years earlier, the ark. All right, let's talk about the purpose of the tabernacle and the temple, because our author is spending a lot of time on it. It's so easy to get lost in the elaborate details of the temple and lose sight of what the building meant to the lives of the Israelites, to the entire Bible, and finally to our redemption through Christ. The temple was a sacred space for God. It was also a visible reminder to the Israelites that the world was a sacred space that belonged to God. So the purpose of the temple actually started in Genesis with the garden. Now hang with me here. The Garden of Eden was the first dwelling place for God to have a relationship with man. God created the world, and then in that creation, he made the garden, and he had fellowship there with Adam and Eve. The garden and the fellowship they had was the purest. It was perfection. There was no sin, no separation, no book of laws, decrees, and commands. There was just one rule: don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, Mount Sinai was the second dwelling place for God. God met Moses on the mountain many times, and he had fellowship with Moses and the 70 in a covenant celebration. But the Israelites had to leave Sinai for the promised land, and the mountain could not go with them. So God gave Moses detailed instructions on how to build another dwelling place. God said this to Moses.
In Exodus 25, verse 8, then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you.
So the tabernacle was the third dwelling place for God. The tabernacle was a mobile dwelling place. The design of the tabernacle pointed back to the Garden of Eden, the place of perfect fellowship with God that the Israelites wanted to get back to. The temple, where we are now, is the fourth dwelling place of God. The Israelites were no longer wanderers. They had conquered the promised land, and God had promised that when they entered a period of rest, Solomon could build a permanent temple. Like the tabernacle, the design of the temple points back to the Garden of Eden. All 4 of these dwelling places, Garden of Eden, Mount Sinai, the Tabernacle, the Temple, had a 3-part division that increased in holiness. In the beginning, there was Eden, the garden within Eden, and the tree of life within the garden, the tree of life being the most holy. Don't touch it. At Mount Sinai, the people were at the base of the mountain. Moses' companions like Joshua could keep watch on the second level, but only Moses could go to the top level, the most holy place. Now, in the tabernacle and temple, there is a courtyard where the priest sacrificed for the people. There is a holy place where only certain priests can go, and then there's the most holy place where only the high priest is allowed. Nobody else can touch it. All of this separation from God was caused by the fall. Sin is impure and can only be atoned for by sacrifice. And only when sin had been atoned for can one commune with God. It was a burdensome ritual that took place over and over and over at the temple. The elaborate plan was missing a saving piece. The purpose of the tabernacle and the temple, with its elaborate plan for a place to have fellowship with God, would always fail. The forgiveness of sin was super complicated, and the Israelites could not keep all the laws. But their failure was a part of the plan, and it too had a purpose. It was to point them to the need for the one, the Savior, Jesus Christ. That is why, way back in the beginning, in Genesis 3, God promised them the one, that one seed who could save the world. The Apostle Paul, or it may have been Barnabas, we don't know who wrote Hebrews, but I'm still holding with Paul. The Apostle Paul, or maybe Barnabas or somebody else, connected all the dots like an attorney solving a mystery. He built the case for what Moses and the Israelites couldn't have even imagined. The missing piece to all this sacrifice was Christ. Listen to how he laid out his case to the Hebrews.
Hebrews chapter 9. Now, the first covenant had regulations for worship and also an earthly sanctuary. A tabernacle was set up. In its first room were the lampstand and the table with its consecrated bread. This was called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a room called the most holy place, which had the golden altar of incense and the gold-covered ark of the covenant. This ark contained the gold jar of manna, Aaron's staff that had budded, and the stone tablets of the covenant. Above the ark were the cherubim of the glory, overshadowing the atonement cover. But we cannot discuss these things in detail now. When everything had been arranged like this, the priests entered regularly in the outer room to carry on their ministry. But only the high priest entered the inner room, and that only once a year, and never without blood, which he offered for himself and for the sins the people had committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit was showing by this that the way into the most holy place had not yet been disclosed as long as the first tabernacle was still functioning. This is an illustration for the present time, indicating that the gifts and sacrifices being offered were not able to clear the conscience of the worshiper. They are only a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings, external regulations applying until the time of the new order.
So right here, Paul is saying that, okay, you all know this. The tabernacle was set up. There's the most holy place. They had this ritual. They had this sacrifice. They had the high priest. But guess what? It wasn't clearing the conscience of the worshiper. It was only food and drink and various washings, external regulations applying until the time of the new order. The missing piece. Listen to the next part.
Verse 11. But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands. That is to say, is not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who were ceremonially unclean, sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that led to death, so that we may serve the living God? The high priest, who was the mediator of the Mosaic covenant, has been replaced. For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. In the case of a will, it is necessary to prove the death of the one who made it, because a will is in force only when somebody has died. It never takes effect while the one who made it is living. This is why even the first covenant was not put into effect without blood. When Moses had proclaimed every command of the law to all the people, he took the blood of calves together with water, scarlet wool, and branches of hyssop, and sprinkled the scroll and all the people. He said, "This is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you to keep." In the same way, he sprinkled the blood, both the tabernacle and everything used in its ceremonies. In fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. It was necessary then for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices. He is talking about the things in the tabernacle, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with human hands that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven himself, now to appear for us in God's presence. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood that is not his own. Otherwise, Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world. But he has appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. Just as people are destined to die once and after that to face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many, and he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him.
So what was the missing piece that brought down the barrier to God? Jesus. Moses may have had the plan for the tabernacle, and Solomon had the plan for the temple, but Paul understood the plan in its entirety, from beginning to end, including the missing piece, that one high priest who will end the separation of the veil and the sacrificing of animals for the atonement of sin. No more tent, no more ark, no more sacrifice, no more blood. Because Jesus, the missing piece to God's plan, has taken the high priest's place, and the physical temple became you.
1 Corinthians 3:16. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst?
God's sacred space is no longer restricted to the most holy place in a tent or a temple. It lives in the heart and soul of every believer. You are a mobile tabernacle and a living temple.
What's a club without friends? If you're enjoying the Bible Book Club, why don't you share it? And then you can say, "Welcome to the club." New episodes drop every Monday, and get all episodes now on Amazon Music. As always, head over to susanme.com/Bible Book Club for show notes from today's episode. Bible Book Club is hosted by Susan Merrill and Heather Rubio, edited by Buck Buchanan, produced by Haley Mawat.